Good afternoon, and welcome back from lunch. I hope you enjoyed it. Starting off the afternoon proceedings, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Benedict Evans for a keynote before our first panel. Benedict is an internationally renowned technology analyst based in London. He's spent 20 years analysing mobile, media and tech, and has worked across equity research, consulting and venture capital. He looks at questions about what matters in tech, what's going on, what it means and what happens next. He writes essays on these themes, published on benevans.com, and a weekly newsletter with over 170,000 subscribers, a number that includes myself. So very pleased for that reason to be able to hand over to Benedict.
Great, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry I can't be there today. I'm in Chicago for various complicated reasons. I was asked to talk about regulated technology, and I thought it would be kind of useful to start just by giving a brief sense of what technology itself is interested in and thinking about at the moment. Which by and large, as I sort of discovered sometimes to my cost, is not regulation. And in fact, if one talks to people working in the sort of Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, they'll kind of tell you the same thing. That's not where the traffic is. And whenever I write about regulation, no one reads it, except people who work for regulators. But I thought nonetheless, it would be kind of useful to dig into, therefore, from the other side. And so I think if one was to ask what's important in technology 5 years ago, one would have said mobile, and the whole conversation would have been about smartphones. Today, there's sort of three different conversations that are going on and kind of in parallel. Firstly, there's a bunch of people in technology thinking about what we'll be doing in 2030, ideas like kind of Web3 and metaverse and quantum and so on. Secondly, though, most actual technology companies today are deploying ideas from 2010, 2015, ideas like kind of SaaS and cloud and machine learning. And then the rest of the economy is being overturned by ideas from sort of 1995 and 2000, and ideas like maybe people will buy stuff on the internet. So you have these three kind of very separate conversations depending on which part of the technology industry you're talking to, and obviously which other industry you're talking to as well. And so looking at each of those very briefly, those visions for the future, there are these two kind of generalized concepts for things that would be a universal platform that you build stuff on. That would be the next smartphone, if you like, or the next open source. And that is Web3 and metaverse, which I'll talk about in a second. Meanwhile, there's lots of other technologies out there that are kind of narrower and deeper. So things like quantum or robotics or computational biology, which are also very interesting, but not things that you might remake the whole of the tech industry around. However, Web3 and metaverse are both these sorts of ideas that this is the next generational change in technology. And so Web3 is an idea that cryptocurrencies are not just store of money or speculation or money or financial transfers, but instead that a blockchain is a computer that you can use to build software. And so that you would be able to build a podcast system or a Twitter or an Instagram or indeed an Amazon running on a blockchain in a way that would be public and distributed, in which all the participants would have votes. Meanwhile, metaverse, to the extent it means anything, and I'm afraid it's now becoming an impossibly vague term. But what it meant originally was the idea that VR and AR would be the next universal device, that everyone would wear a pair of glasses, just as everyone has a smartphone today. And both of these, of course, would be complete resets of the market environment. So just as we went from mainframes to PCs, we changed who was in charge when we went from PCs to the web, and then from the web to smartphones. Those reset the technology market. And so the people working on both of these believe that this is a way that we will reset the market again. Meanwhile, the rest of the tech industry, I think, can best be summed up by this phrase digital transformation, which always sounds like a kind of a parody of marketing slogans. Said the other day that if you say digital transformation 3 times, then a partner from Accenture will appear in the corner of the room and offer you a contract. But what it actually means is that in the 70s, big companies got mainframes, and in the 90s, they moved from mainframes to PCs. And now they're moving to cloud and software as a service and machine learning. And those are kind of generational changes in how enterprise computing works. And as you go through that change, you have an order of magnitude more software. You go from having half a dozen applications to having 50, 100, 250 applications inside big companies. So massively more software companies. And those are all kind of fundamentally changing what it is that the company might be doing, how it might be doing its work, just as we did when we went from mainframes to PCs. Then in the rest of the economy, everything the internet did to music or newspapers is now happening to everyone else. So this is a visualization of that. This is the decline from peak of newspaper advertising, bookstores, and then pay TV in the USA. And the point here really is a time lag, that the same kinds of processes are applying to all of these, but it took 20 years between the decline of newspapers and the decline of pay TV. And as you go through that process, there's a sort of fundamental unbundling of everything. All the value chains and the gatekeeping based on physical break apart. You have new models and new entrants and new gatekeepers and new winners. And you could have made that slide in 1995. It's just a question of when it happens. Particularly topical in the UK, that's been happening in TV. And so it means that UK broadcasters are suddenly competing with US media companies, which always had much bigger budgets, but never competed directly. But now Netflix and Amazon are competing directly. And so UK 16 to 34s watch more subscription videos, so basically more Netflix, than all content from all UK broadcasters combined. So they've gone from being big fish in a small pond to small fish in a global pond. The retail industry itself, of course, has had a huge surge of adoption as we went through the pandemic, varied a great deal by what country we're in. But what I wanted to show with this chart is a kind of a slightly unusual way of splitting retail. Instead of saying that you have apparel and shoes and toys and books, and those are all different categories, instead I've divided this into food and non-food on the basis that not food has to be delivered or collected, but non-food can come through the mail. And so if you look at UK retail on the basis of everything except food, we've gone from 30% penetration to 40% online penetration, just pretty profound consequences for anybody in brand or retail, or indeed thinking about council taxes or thinking about commercial property. One consequence of that acceleration is that as we've broken all these channels apart, we have new entrants. And so Shein, which is a Chinese smartphone-only fast fashion brand, is now the largest US fashion retailer, bigger than Zara and H&M combined. And it's done that with no stores, instead app only, and with all the acquisition budget going into advertising instead of to rent. Meanwhile, Amazon has built its own toll booth, as channels always do. So Amazon did $31 billion of advertising revenue in 2021, and $31 billion of ad revenue is not only probably producing more cash flow than AWS, but it also means that the Amazon ad business is bigger than YouTube, bigger than the global newspaper industry, roughly the same size as Google's display business. So another example of, I think, an unexpected, unanticipated competitor is Shopify, which provides software to make it easy to run an online store. And Shopify's customers did about $175 billion of e-commerce in 2021. Which means that Shopify was about 45% of the size of Amazon Marketplace. So this is now one of Amazon's biggest competitive questions: isn't a consumer-facing brand, doesn't run its own store, would not fit in a conventional market definition of Amazon or as an e-commerce vendor. And then one more example of an unconventional competitor is Apple, which decided to use its control of the smartphone platform to insert itself into the advertising industry, despite not having an ad industry, having a material ad business of its own. With this rather interesting formulation, it's rather like the Yes Minister joke, that I give confidential briefings, you leak, and he's being prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. And so Apple has this formulation that we personalize ads, and that's completely different from tracking. I made this point on Twitter a while ago, and Adam Mosseri, the head of product for Instagram, replied he would be very happy to use the language that Apple uses for its own products, but instead Apple forces him to use Apple's language to describe his product. Now, if one thinks about all of the things that are going on, therefore, I think the for anybody in the consumer industry, consumer or retail or brand, there's sort of two fundamental questions. There's a logistics question, like how do I get it? And then there's a discovery question, how would I know what I want? And in the past, you had all these separate budgets that weren't really interchangeable. So you couldn't say, should we open stores in that country or just advertise there? But now you can. Now you say, should we advertise? Should we have free shipping? Should we put the money on Instagram or into returns? Those all become one budget. And so all of those kind of questions of how you touch a customer have been kind of thrown wide open. Hence, one of the most interesting announcements in the last couple of weeks is that Unilever no longer has a CMO, because the CMO role is now also responsible for selling directly to consumers, which is something they've never done before. Now, but stepping back from that, though, and circling back to the tech industry, I think it's kind of interesting how many of these spaces the broader tech industry isn't interested in. And so, and neither Google nor Facebook have a significant presence in TV. Indeed, Apple isn't really doing anything in TV. We are on a very small experimental budget. And so a useful kind of way of looking at this is that the technology industry builds something that changes other markets. But Meanwhile is fundamentally concerned in technology. So technology now thinks about quantum and metaverse and Web3. It doesn't think about the music industry. So if I now shift and talk kind of directly about the regulatory consequences of all of this, I think it's kind of useful to get a sense of scale and to think about just how quickly technology has become so much more important than it was in the past. That when Netscape kicked off the consumer internet, there were maybe 50 to 75 million PCs on Earth. Even when Facebook launched, there were less than 1 billion people using a computer. And now there's close to 5 billion people. And so the importance of technology has happened really very, very quickly. And of course, as it's become so much bigger, software ate the world. And so all the world's problems get expressed in software. All the bad people are on the internet, all of our own worst instincts are on the internet. And so we have this kind of wave of ideas around things that we need, that are social and political problems, things that need regulation, things that need policy intervention of some kind. And I think that's kind of natural and normal. And it's kind of interesting to compare that with a bunch of other industries, such as, for example, railways or industrial food or cars, all of which were also big and important and complex and got industry-specific regulation. But it's also, I think, important to kind of pause a minute and say, well, what do we mean when we say we regulate cars? Because if we actually think about what that means, there's sort of 10 or 15 or 20 different questions, and those are all kind of complicated. And you can't actually go to General Motors and tell them that they need to stop teenage boys from getting drunk and driving too fast, or that we need to build more urban mass transit. And so there were many different questions, and there were questions for different companies, also questions for different regulators, and many of them have trade-offs. This is kind of a nice illustration of the problem. This is Amsterdam, I think in 1900, 1970, and then today. That was a set of political decisions around how you treated a city. Should you pedestrianize the city or not? That was not a competition question. And so I think the general kind of point I would try and make is that there's a kind of common thing that people in technology say is that technology policy is too complicated and it's full of trade-offs and it's too hard and it's too difficult. I'm not saying that. What I would suggest is that policy itself, in fact, is complicated and full of trade-offs. And technology actually isn't any different from any other field of policy. It's not any easier or simpler or to resolve than any other field of policy. Where it is different, I think, is how quickly it's happened. So this compares the growth of cars in the USA with the growth of Facebook. That we all grew up with cars. We all understood that if you ask General Motors to make cars with gasoline that doesn't burn, they kind of can't do that. We don't necessarily have the kind of the same innate understanding of what a market definition might be, what a competitive pressure might be in technology. And so to just draw that thread out a little bit more, I wanted to give some examples. So this is a very widespread, widely known proposal from Elizabeth Warren, American senator and presidential candidate. You can't run a platform and compete on it. Well, that sounds good. It also has a great advantage that you can kind of fit it in a tweet, and you can fit it on the bumper sticker of your car. So I thought I would show you this ad. This is an ad for a piece of software called Sideways from 1987 that lets you print your spreadsheet in landscape. That's what it does. This is a piece of software that lets you print your spreadsheet in landscape. So in other words, it's that button. Now, I don't think many of us believe that that button should be illegal, and there should be a separate way to install a print preferences dialog box. And so this kind of gets to the challenge. We all kind of agree that it was a problem that Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer in Windows in the late 1990s. But none of us today believe that a new phone shouldn't come with a web browser. And I think most of us would understand that if you actually follow Elizabeth Warren's logic to its natural, if you follow the natural logic of that, then when you buy an iPhone, you wouldn't have any apps on it because any of them are things that somebody would want to compete with. Indeed, I'm old enough to remember when you could buy a separate camera for your phone because phones didn't have cameras. And so when phone companies integrated cameras, that was unfair competition to the people who wanted to sell you a separate camera, but that was actually kind of the nature of integration. So again, it's kind of interesting and difficult. My favorite kind of argument in this category is that Amazon competes with its suppliers. Amazon has private label products. This is a table from an FTC study from 1932 listing retailers that provided private label products, which is basically all retailers for the last century. All retailers for the last century have used data and analytics and steering and self-preferencing to steer people to buy their own white label products. So what is it exactly that's different when Amazon does this? And then a third, I think, interesting discussion, and this has been a particular talking point in European antitrust, European competition, is this observation that large technology companies have bought huge numbers of startups in the last decade. And so prompted by this, late last year, the FTC did a study and got Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft to give them data on everything that they bought. And it turns out the number is that those companies had bought about 400 startups between 2010 and 2019, which sounds like a big number until you divide it by 10 and then divide it by 5. And you realize, yeah, it's actually not that many companies per company per year. More important, though, is if you look at what those companies are, 80% of them were less than a $50 million acquisition, and most of them have less than 10 staff. And so you have to ask, if you're an entrepreneur and you've been building your company for 5 years and you've only got 7 people, and Google comes along and offers you $5 million and you say yes, why would you say yes? Because it's the entrepreneur's choice to say yes. And the answer is you probably weren't a big competitive threat to Google if you took a $5 million check, particularly in the funding environment of the last couple of years. And that takes me to kind of a final sort of set of data to point to. I often wonder how many people outside the technology industry understand how many startups there are. Those people in the room, my apologies for those who don't, I hope this will be informative. In Silicon Valley, every year, the US venture industry funds roughly 3,000 new companies and then gives follow-on funding to another 8,000 to 10,000 companies. So there's about 3,000 to 4,000 new startups every single year. And if one looks at the funding environment for that, obviously 2021 was kind of
I'm wondering how long to leave it before concluding. I'm just going to, maybe backstage, to let me know prospects for bringing it back on.
to kind of challenges and kinds of challenge that are kind of new. And the obvious one, of course, is geography. What does it mean for a UK or European regulator to tell Facebook to do something, particularly to tell it to have an opinion on an acquisition that maybe wasn't in the UK? Secondly, how do we think about market definition? You know, what kind of market definition would put Amazon and Shopify in the same category? What kind of market definition would apply when generally the most important competitive threat to a company comes from somebody changing what the market is? You know, Microsoft did not do mainframes. Google did not do PC software. Facebook did not do a search engine. Snapchat does not do a social feed. And so generally the biggest competitive threat to a technology company comes from somebody who's doing something different. Then, of course, there's the speed point that I think we all understand, that it's a problem to spend 5 years doing the market analysis and doing the project on an industry that changes this quickly. And finally, of course, conflict. I was at a competition conference at the beginning of last year, where beginning of 2020 rather, where a competition regulator said, well, I go and tell a technology company to do this, and they go across the road to the privacy regulator who tells them not to do that. And so just to illustrate each of these, firstly, this is breakdown of global advertising revenue. The UK is bigger than France and Germany combined, incidentally, as it is for most technology measures. But which regulators in which places do things that apply to which parts of the market? How do you think about market definition when, as I showed you this chart earlier, Amazon's biggest competitive question is a company that isn't a consumer-facing brand at all? How do you think about speed when the center of the tech industry changes entirely every 10 to 15 years? It's not just kind of the nature of the product or that particular question, but even the question of who's dominant changes completely. Because what you see here is IBM and then Microsoft and Intel, and then Google and Facebook and Amazon, and then Apple and Samsung. And so you have changes in where the dominance is. So that kind of prompts the question, well, dominance of what? IBM still has market dominance in the mainframe business. The mainframe business, in fact, is still growing if you measure it in compute capacity. But nobody in the tech industry has thought about mainframes or IBM for about 20 years. So which dominance is it that we're thinking about? And of course, how do we think about those conflicts? There's as I said, if competition regulator goes to Facebook and says, make it easier to export my data, and the privacy regulator goes to Facebook and says, make it harder to export my data, and the engineers at Facebook says, well, we're engineers, we can do either. but we can't do both. And I think that kind of takes me to a final point, which is this is a screenshot from the EU's draft DMA. This is the last public draft, in which the EU decided that decided that messaging apps should be interoperable. What that has to do with markets, I have absolutely no idea, because they're not markets. But be that as it may, it decided that messaging apps should be interoperable. And so here's the relevant clause. Now, imagine, again, you're an engineer being told to implement this. What are you being told? Well, you have to allow any provider. So those 5 engineers in the government building in a suburb of St. Petersburg have built a messaging app. Well, that's any provider, so you have to give them access. So if somebody makes an app that lets them spam all WhatsApp users, you have to give them access. And you have to give them the data under the same conditions and quality that you have, which means you have to give them all the data that you have. And you have to guarantee them data protection. Well, which of those is it that you want us to do? You want Facebook or Instagram or YouTube to give, or Google or Apple to give any third party completely unlimited and restricted access to their users without any restrictions at all, while also guaranteeing security and data protection. That's not really on the list of options. So one final comment, and this is a Dilbert cartoon from about 20 years ago. These are kind of questions that come up quite often. And they're questions, I think, that sometimes reflect my chart comparing car adoption to Facebook adoption. Absolutely, we need to regulate the tech industry. Absolutely, we need competition regulation and privacy regulation. But we kind of need to understand how that fits into the context of the market and the technology, just as we did when we regulated cars. And we kind of need to understand that absolute statements generally don't work very well. And so with that, I will stop, reach the end of my presentation. And then I think we have now a panel conversation.
That's right. Thanks very much, Benedict. That was an amazing amount of information, insight, challenges, all in the space of 24 minutes. And now I know there'll be lots of questions. Indeed, I have a few of my own, but you're going to have to be patient because you get a chance to ask Benedict questions as part of the next panel. So I'm going to introduce the chair of the next panel, who is Dr. Vicky Nash. Vicky is director of the Oxford Internet Institute, where she's responsible for leading the department's engagement in digital policy matters. Her particular research interests draw on her background as a political theorist and concern the theoretical and practical interpretation of liberal values in the internet era. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Vicky, who's going to introduce your panelists.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm sorry, I should have given you something that would have been a slightly more relevant introduction for this audience, but never mind. So it's a huge pleasure to be here today. I've got a fantastic panel that we're going to bring for your delectation. We are also going to be hearing from Ben later on, and another virtual member as well. But if I can bring up my physical members first of all, please. So I'm going to have Nick Sieber, who is here. He's partner at Deloitte and head of European tech regulation. Next, we have Brian O'Kelly, a fantastic tech entrepreneur, co-founder and CEO of Scope3. And I'm hoping that virtually, if we can bring her in, we have Dame Wendy Hall, who is the Regis Professor of Computer Science at University of Southampton, and I should say somewhat of an academic goddess in my field for her founding with others of web science. Wendy is not on Zoom, I gather. Is she joining us at all, or is she not joining us at all? No, Wendy, no problem. So that means we'll have a little bit longer to talk, which is no bad thing. If I can kick off, so the focus of this panel really, I suppose, is to make us think ahead, to look ahead, to think a bit about what the most important technologies and trends are that the competition and consumer agencies need to be focusing on in the next few years. Now, it's up to you whether you want to think very near term, slightly further away. I'm hoping we'll cover both in the panel. I think we're going to start, if it's okay, with Nick. Very kind of you. I know you stepped in at the last minute for Paul, who is unfortunately ill. But if I can hand over to you, and I think you've got some exciting new data from Deloitte to share with us. Thank you.
I do. And for anyone with slides, going after Benedict is a slightly daunting proposition, doubly so when you step in quite late. So I'm going to be talking on behalf of my colleague Paul Lee. He is the head of research in TMT for Deloitte. It's a role which we take very seriously. It's his only role. He doesn't serve clients other than generating amazing insight. And I'm going to be talking today about our Digital Consumer Trends Survey. It's a survey we've run for 7 years. As it says on the slide, it covers about 40,000 people in 23 countries. We run it with professional polling support in the UK. We delivered it to 4,150 adults in a demographically proper format. It was run by Ipsos. It finished in May, so we have a huge, huge amount of data which we're just working through. And so today I'm going to be talking about 5 observations which we've pulled out in order to provide this world premiere of our data this year. I was expecting a bigger reaction, but I'll go with that. Thank you for humouring me. Okay, so as I said, five observations which we're going to make. The first is around a new question we asked for the first time this year, which was to try and understand consumers' expectations of who is responsible for protecting them against various online threats. And you can see that we asked them about keeping data private, preventing cyber attacks, preventing misinformation, and then preventing counterfeit or stolen products being sold online. And broadly, you can see from the data that consumers are saying it's not us, it's not the users. It is either online platforms or governments and regulators. And we think that this is a reasonable attitude for consumers to have. As we were talking earlier on, in any other part of our lives, it's unreasonable to have to make your own padlocks and figure out some of the stuff. You know, if I go to a supermarket and I buy an egg sandwich, I shouldn't need to test it for salmonella. If I buy a hairdryer, hypothetically, I don't need to make sure that it's not going to electrocute me. And if I'm looking at my online pension statement, I shouldn't be worried that my life savings are going to disappear. You know, we have a reasonable expectation that in our modern lives, we are protected. Now, one thing which I would say is that the ongoing crisis of consumer trust and consumer protection in the world of crypto and Web3, which is obviously a very current topic of conversation as we're seeing various stable coins. I use the rabbit ears as an understatement. Stable coins, it turns out, not so stable. Funds for holding crypto investments are not so stable either. And we see this as a huge opportunity for regulators to potentially step in and maybe help give consumers more trust that gas fees and scams and frauds are not going to mean that their precious assets are going to evaporate. Another question we asked was about whether individuals have taken steps to protect their privacy by making use of different functionality on their devices or services. And you can see here that 35% of people have avoided buying a device because of privacy concerns. This came up last night over dinner talking about home personal assistants, connected assistants in the home. 56% of people have avoided using a service because of privacy concerns, and then the last one, 58% have avoided connecting different functions of a device, like camera functionality, because of privacy concerns. This is obviously interesting data, and our data often appears as little footnotes on other presentations like Benedict's. One of the things we found, though, and I don't have a slide to show it, is that the individuals who are most likely to use these services and devices are also most likely to be confident in turning these services off. And we think, our hypothesis is that growing familiarity and experience of using digital devices and services means that when people are setting up an app, they're quite happy to say, no, I don't want to share my location right now until I understand what the value proposition is or what I'm getting from that. Or I don't want to use the camera, I don't want to have notifications. And this is unlike, say, 20 years ago. If you were setting up a new computer, you might feel very worried that if you don't click all the default options, something's going to go wrong and then you're not going to be able to use it. So we feel like this is actually a positive thing, that the most competent and confident users are happy to not use different aspects of functionality because they can use them later on if they want to. This is a question on here which we've asked for a number of years now, and we've seen an increasing level of likelihood that users accept all cookies. So the top point here is that about 3/4 of users accept default cookie settings at least half of the time. Anecdotally, from speaking to media companies, our view is that it's probably more than this. And this is an example of what Jonathan called the privacy paradox yesterday, that users are much more likely to accept, even if their own self-belief is that they decline those permissions quite often. Another aspect of that same theme I referred to just now is that we also see an increasing level of awareness about what companies do with the data which is shared online, but also a decline in the level of anxiety about that data being shared. And again, we think that this is a trend towards increasing understanding that because of prominent data protection regulations, consumers are actually feeling like sharing their data is not going to lead to terrible outcomes. It's just a case of value exchange online. So we're maybe feeling quite positive on that front. We also see a number of instances of people using private browsing or app tracking changes. One of the findings in our survey was that there was much more, I think twice as many male users as female use private browsing and the kind of no history when they're browsing the internet. We don't know what that could be linked to. If anyone has any ideas, I would love to hear that afterwards, if anyone has a view. This is the second last of the bits of insight which I'm going to share. So this is about the preference towards tailored ads. And I think on that point about a continued theme, you can see that there is a much greater preference towards seeing tailored ads for people who are trending younger on the demographics. But again, those individuals are also much more likely to use non-tracking browsers and search engines when they browse. So we think it's again that sense of having their cake and eating it, wanting to be able to both benefit from personalized experiences online when it suits them, and also to hide their web usage when it suits them too. The last thing which I'm going to talk about very briefly is just going back to that point about cryptocurrency. And we saw two things. One is that the understanding and intent to purchase cryptocurrencies is pretty low, other than for a group of users who are broadly 18 to 24, 25 to 34 years old. That also trended towards male users as well. This study was conducted in April and May, so even in the last month, there's been a huge change, I think, a sea change maybe in that level of trust around crypto, and we've seen with some high-profile collapses of different services that I would expect if we were to run that same question again this month, the intent to purchase crypto would be significantly lower. I guess in wrapping up, the thing which I would say is, as regulators, providing clarity, transparency, giving users confidence they understand the rules of the road and where they're protected and where they're not. You know, where does caveat emptor apply and where doesn't it? That, I think, is a really important thing to get right. And if you can do that, the usage of these different services will increase, and the utility and value which society and individuals get from them will increase as well. So that's my little spiel.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's very interesting just to hear you talk about the differences between different age groups, and we can reflect on that later. I think some of the work we've done at OII, over about the last sort of 15 years now, suggests actually that another course important difference is between those demographic groups within age groups. Yeah. So the idea being that younger users may generally be better at protecting themselves, more aware, more literate, etc. But even within that, there'll still be some individuals who are vulnerable or less able. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. We have good news. So you'll see we do have the wonderful Wendy Hall with us. So I'm going to turn to Wendy next. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid I introduced you in your absence earlier, so I'm not going to do it again. Can you hear us?
I can. I thought I was coming in at the beginning of the panel. I should have been listening more to that.
That's all right. You can do it. You can do it without
it
everybody
hasn't
else.
Here that the panel's. Oh, I see. You were a keynote, Ben. I do apologise. I'm so sorry. I thought you were. I saw you as part of the panel. I hadn't realised. I've missed what you said. Could you just repeat a few things? What was the? Come on, Vicky, help me. What was the big take home from Ben's talk?
Ben's talk. Oh my goodness.
Quick recap.
Yeah, old technology, new technology, looking at the future, and also, think very carefully, I suppose, about how markets are disrupted constantly and remade, and also maybe unlearn some things you thought you knew about some of the sort of key regulatory principles we work with.
Right.
Over to you.
Is this my bit then?
This is your bit, Wendy. You've got 5 whole minutes, all just for you. But I can go to Brian. I can go to someone next if you prefer it.
No. I'm perfectly happy, Vicky, to do my bit now. I'm here in my office, which is amazing. I'm sorry I couldn't join you, but I had to be here today. The whiteboard makes me look like a professor behind me. So, so you asked me to talk about. I don't really know anything about, markets and competition down the pipe, and I'd love to. And I think let me just talk about AI first, because I have the national AI strategy sort of hat on. I'm on the AI Council, thinking about AI skills, and AI is everywhere and at the moment, and I think I was quoted the other day as saying AI is invisible, and it largely is. People talk about AI machines. Actually, AI is mostly software, and it is coming into our lives in many different ways. And actually, if you're talking about, I heard Ben talk about marketing and markets. It's one of the ways that it's coming in a very invisible way, because it's sometimes very hard to know whether, although there was a big story this week about whether the Google AI was sentient. And I think I can categorically say it wasn't, because people like Mike Walters at Oxford is saying that too. And we don't have sentient AI yet, but we certainly have AI that can mimic human conversation to a certain extent. And there's also, the thing about Elon Musk buying Twitter, and his sticking point at the moment is Twitter can't prove they've only less than 5,000 of their people on Twitter. I hate using the word users, by the way, because we're not users, we're prosumers. We produce data. We are not just users. We are part of the social machine, which Vicky will have heard me talk about before. This people and technology doing things together, they don't really realise but we are part of that social machine, not just users of machines. But the thing about, I think it's very valid to ask how many people registered on Twitter are people and how many are not people, are bots, or I think it's a really valid, and we are sleepwalking into a world where that's going to get worse and worse and worse. And if you think about the metaverse, I've gone off into the metaverse before I've really finished on AI. You've got all these problems on steroids. Who are you talking to? What are you talking to? How do you know who anybody is? And this issue about anonymity, protecting anonymity, which some people want to, go to the death over, is part of the problem, right? We need I think we need to really grasp verifiable credentials, distributed identities, things that the standards people are working on, to help us make sense of this world and try and make sure you do know who is talking to you and who you are talking to, or at least you could check. And we do, you know, when we do anything with the banks, you have to prove who you are before you can open a bank account. We need to do this in the Wild West of the internet. And then there's the question of who governs that, who regulates this space, and that we're talking about several different things that are coming together. You've got the issue of who regulates, who governs the internet, and you've got the issue of who regulates and how you regulate artificial intelligence, which is not an easy thing to answer. At the moment, the EU have put out have their act going through, which is a largely risk-based approach to AI regulation. The US, as I talk about, I'll just plug the Four Internets book, you know, you take the cultural values of the region you're in. So the US is largely consumer market force-led. Oh gosh, I was supposed to turn that off, wasn't I? China, of course, has a very different approach to all this altogether. It's government controlled. But here in the UK, through the Office for AI, one of the big things they're going to be doing this year is producing a paper for consultation on how the UK wants to regulate AI, or its approach to regulating AI. And there's always the issue of don't regulate too fast or too much, but you've got to keep people safe in some way. And I think I'll finish. I've probably done about 4 minutes, have I? Something like that. I don't know, Vicky, am I okay for another minute?
Last half minute, go on, Wendy.
Yeah. I want to finish by just mentioning Web 3 without the 0.0. This is the new wave coming where it's a big change in the way the internet might run. And I do feel it's time for it, but it's a question of how it comes and what the standards are and who. But this is the idea where we get our data back. We give the power back to the people. The idea that we all manage our data in Tim Berners-Lee would call it a pod, or a wallet, or a vault, or whatever you call it, using some sort of trusted third parties like we do with banks and our money, just to manage that for you over your lifetime, and it will completely flip the business model of the current web and internet. That's coming down the pipe quite fast, and I think that will affect this business. It will change a lot of things and shift the power on the internet. If we can do that, I don't know. It's all hype at the moment. It's not. And just yesterday, I read, I think it's just gone out this week, that Jack Dorsey, who was the founder and CEO of Twitter, has launched something called Web 5. We're jumping over 4. That's a marketing thing, but this is a part of a major movement shift that's going on in terms of trying to get the data away from the hyperscalers and the datagopolis and give the power back to the people, but that has to be incredibly well, I don't want to just say regulated, but it has to be done in a way that enables people to keep their data safe. Lots of issues. I'm going to finish there. I could talk about it forever, but that's it.
Thank you, Wendy, very much. So a couple of quite big issues to think about there. I think perhaps the role in the near term of AI and the regulatory challenges that poses, and then these possibly very different models of the web that we might be in, well, quite ideologically based models, I would argue, but that might or might not be coming. Brian, you get the last 5-minute contribution here. How would you see this as an entrepreneur, CEO of a company? Are we identifying the right things? Would you push this in a different direction?
Well, I'll start by saying that when I was asked to speak, I was fairly intimidated. I'm a longtime follower of Benedict, brilliant computer scientist, the full resources of Deloitte. How could I compete on a vision for the future? And I get the privilege of being last, and I will say that, Ben, none of your charts went past 2021. I would love to see the trend line for where all those things are going to be. You're showing us data about what people think today. Will these even be relevant in 10 years? 10 years ago, crypto was not on our radar, and 10 years from now, crypto may not be on our radar. 10 days from now, it may not. But I thought that one really interesting point was that for me, in the world that I live in, crypto is very important. But that survey showed that for very few people, is it an important issue? And I think that's the biggest challenge when we think about the future. My job as an entrepreneur is to create a future. I go to investors. I'm one of those, thousands of companies that get funded every year. And I pitch a vision for a future that's different than today. My current vision is that we should factor carbon into every decision we make, that we should have an environment-driven economy, that consumers should make decisions. We should push consumers to buy products. We should have advertising factor in the carbon of the underlying infrastructure. Benedict's presentation didn't mention sustainability. Wendy didn't mention sustainability. You didn't mention it. Why is that me that's the only person up here who thinks that this is a major issue for the next decade? If I did a show of hands, I'll do my own survey, how many of you think this is something that people care about and that will impact technology over the next decade? I want to do a bet because I like money. How many of you think that the other issues that Benedict raised are more likely to be important at this conference in 10 years than either the metaverse or Web3? I'm willing to bet one of those is more important, or one that's not even on that list. And I'm sure somebody has a prediction market that they can take the other side of it. But I think that's the interesting part for me as an entrepreneur. 15 years ago, I invented a new way of targeting ads. Programmatic advertising, the ad exchange, DSPs, SSPs. If you don't know what those are, you're very fortunate. So many national security issues, privacy issues, competition issues. If you know what Jedi Blue is, that was me. I invented header bidding. If you follow the whole thing with YouTube and Google, that was me too. That was me they were kicking off of YouTube and my startup, which was kicking Google's butt. And then they kicked my butt. So I've been at the middle of trying to bring a new technology to life. And you know how much support I got from regulators? None. I went to DC and said, Google's cheating. And they said, who cares? Facebook is also doing the same thing as Google. They're launching an ad exchange. That ad exchange was a disaster. It never really launched, but that was enough of an excuse for Google to keep cheating, I'll say. You don't have to say that. But I think that's the real problem for innovation, is that the ideas we brought into the world needed regulation. We had major problems with privacy. We had major problems with the impact of these new technologies on people. And by the time we finally understand them well enough to poll people about how they feel about cookies and privacy, guess what? Cookies are going away. That question is irrelevant if Google ever does what they say they'll do and rips cookies out of the browser. And now we have cookieless technology, which just means they use our emails. It is worse. And it's not in the browser. It's not a browser preference. We have no control. And when Apple says, hide my email, there's a new startup that helps publishers reject hidden emails. We are in an arms race for consumer data. We are in an arms race for innovation. And that arms race is one that's being funded by billions and billions of dollars of money from Silicon Valley, and it's being fought by tens of billions of dollars from Google and Facebook and Apple. And even knowing the companies that matter is hard. 15 years ago, what internet company was the largest in the world? Yahoo. Yahoo had the most consumer attention. It was the most advanced behavioral advertising company in the world. Today, Yahoo barely exists and definitely doesn't matter. I believe Facebook today is the Yahoo of 2007. I believe that consumers aren't going to use the core Facebook product in 10 years. I don't, and I don't miss it. I think Instagram is extremely vulnerable to competitors. I think we see TikTok. I think the interoperability point is critical because it's allowed Facebook to hold on to this data monopoly. I think that watching how we as consumers use these products is fascinating, and I think we should keep doing the work that Benedict does. I think we should be very careful about AI. But I'm not here because I'm a great futurist. I'm here because I'm an entrepreneur, and my job is to create a future that is better than the one we live in today. And I believe that's why all of you are here and care. We all want the same thing. We want a better future. We just have no idea what it's going to look like.
So to me, that's a really excellent point to finish on, because I'm going to ask a question to you and also to Benedict that I was thinking about. And actually, I must apologise, Benedict. I do feel Wendy put me on the spot there in the same way that I put my students on the spot, and I think I failed the task that she set me of summarising your excellent talk. So apologies to you for that. It's all right, Wendy, don't worry. But as I was listening to everybody speak, so one of the sort of most basic questions I think, in this sort of debate is what counts as a disruptive technology, right? So if our concern is that, in this space there are significant network effects often that ensure that the market players that are dominant now in any sector will continue to be dominant for some time, is that really true? And what counts as a disruptor? So in your market, for example, what counts as a really genuinely disruptive technology that you would bet on to be big in the next 10 years? What do you look for?
I have no idea, but I'll tell you the most disruptive technology in the past 20 years is this, that we have computers in our pocket, and that this was the singly most disruptive technology we've seen in our lifetimes, and may, in 50 years, we'll look back to becoming almost like cyborgs with this deeply embedded technology. But I don't know what the next one is. That's sort of the scary point, is that I have no idea.
Benedict, would you agree with that? I mean, you have this fantastic perspective that looks both a long way back and a long way forward. Is it if you look at what did prove to be genuinely disruptive, and I think in those great sort of 15-year cycles that you produced, we could see some of this. Would it have been impossible to predict those in advance? Or can you identify some characteristics of what counts as generally disruptive technologies in this field that should reassure us, if you like, that there will always be competition of a sort?
Well, maybe three answers to that. The first one would be that, Keane said in the long run we're all dead. And so it's perfect. You can say, look, in 15 years' time, Google and Facebook will have disappeared the way Kodak did. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do something if they're being, causing a problem today. But equally, you shouldn't say, well, we have to break them up because otherwise they'll be around for the next 100 years, because that would be like breaking up IBM in 1990. I think I'm actually in a hotel that is the former IBM building in Chicago, which is now no longer in Chicago. Second observation, I think, would be everything is probably disruptive to someone. I mean, my favorite example of this is that online, the web was very disruptive to travel agents, but not really to airlines. So there's a sort of similar conversation now about electric. And this is clearly a huge problem for people who make machine tools and components of the car industry, not necessarily disruptive to the car industry itself. So each of these changes affect something somewhere, but it can be quite hard to predict where. And I think the third one, picking up on the point about mobile, is, imagine you were trying to predict what would happen in smartphones in 2000, and you were not a time traveler, but you got it completely right. You would have said, well, it needs unlimited bandwidth, and it needs to be a real computer running a real PC-class operating system. And the portals will have no role, and the ISPs and telcos will have no role. And people would have said, what do you mean AOL won't have a role? The mobile operators won't have any role at all in the mobile internet. This is insane. So no one would have believed you. And then you just said, well, which companies? Well, obviously Intel and Microsoft and Nokia. And so even if you got it right, you'd have missed kind of the last 10%. That was where all the value was. I think the kind of a general point might be here that there are some industries where talking about what will happen in 10 to 15 years' time is the next product cycle. Whereas in technology, 10 to 15 years' time, you've kind of passed over the horizon into science fiction. You have sort of some vague idea of what we might be able to do in 10 years, but no kind of sensible person would start making predictions about what the technology market structure will look like then. I do think, kind of tying back to the point that I made in one of my slides, that the difference in technology is because it moves so fast, the competitive question is very often something that's changing what the market is, and that doesn't happen every 50 years. It happens every 5 or 10 years' time. The competitive question for Microsoft was the web, and that was only 10 years after Microsoft had effectively become the dominant company in the tech industry, which is kind of well inside the typical reaction cycle of regulation. And so that speed of change isn't just kind of an abstract point, and it's not a reason why you shouldn't do anything, but it does mean that you kind of have to really kind of challenge your market definition.
Fantastic, thank you for that. A question perhaps for Wendy. So Wendy, you've obviously had a very long career looking at the emergence of new technologies, trying to understand them as they emerge, see how they're used, see how they develop and what regulatory challenges I guess they pose. You mentioned a couple there, and I just wanted to bring up Web3 again. I mean, from a competition perspective, of course, this is a great potential offering, the suggestion that we can, really quite radically democratize ownership of key resources that underpin many of these industries, namely data. I know, Ben, I think you might disagree to some extent on this, but Wendy, should we hold out much hope, do you think, for fundamentally different models to underpin, this whole sector?
Well, I think there's a really good point for discussion. There's three things. I had COVID last week, so I might have COVID brain and forget what the three things are. The first one I'm going to talk about the point about sustainability, because as I understand it, right, what Tim Berners-Lee is doing with Solid, he's not using blockchain at all. He's got an architecture and he's putting the data in the pods, and that's what they've got, a not-for-profit doing an open source version of that, and then there's a for-profit selling the way to use it, so that the first people that might use that might be governments as a way to handle managing data with citizens, particularly in health and so on. That doesn't use blockchain. Most of the Web3 things that I see emerging are blockchain plays. Blockchain and crypto plays is coming out of the gaming world, and that worries me on the sustainability point. It worries me on several points, like who's doing the design, is there any diversity in the design of this, or is it just the tech nerds taking over again, and all those issues. But I think sustainability is a big one, and the Jack Dorsey play that he's announced just this week, I think is a play that says, I want to do a new version of it's for the web, let's call it that, but there are new versions of the internet at play as well. But let's just talk about new versions of the web, which puts the whole idea to re-decentralize it and empower people with their own data. The Jack Dorsey play is a sustainability play. And that potentially changes business models. Now, I totally agree, by the way, that I think Facebook's probably, they made a big play on the metaverse, but I just don't think they'll win through on that. And so I do agree on that point. I want to say just something about the different, the big, if you had a model where we manage our data rather than we just, use the social networks, they manage our data in a way that they play it back to us as their market model, as their business model. Then there's all sorts of new business to emerge from that. But you're still going to have to find things. So you're still going to need search engines of some, but they will be different. And I think, so for a company like Google, I think this is and I have no idea, of course, what's going on inside Google. But, there's a huge, if this Web3 happens, we could really, we've got to be able to find who's got what data, and so there's a major play there for a company like Google, which is very different to the Facebook thing, which is, the whole Web3 thing is really anti the Facebook idea. But the other reason why I think we need Web3 is because there is, VR and AR. As you said, I've been around a long time. I've been playing with VR and AR type stuff for many years, as with AI. But what's happening at the moment is the availability of huge compute power, not necessarily sustainable, but we do have a lot of compute power and a lot of data, largely generated because we've got the internet. That's what's enabling the sort of machine learning, deep learning AI developments, and it's what's enabling VR and AR to maybe it's the time that people will want to start, because of what is coming out of the games industry too. I cannot imagine walking around with goggles. At my age, I find it hard to walk around, or generally, let alone with things on my head. But the youngsters will take to all this like ducks to water. But I do think that we are going to have to verify who we are, as I said, in this space. Otherwise, it's going to be such a dangerous place. It's already largely being run by the games industry and the porn industry, and it could become such a dangerous place if you don't have some laws and regulations that somebody's got to know who this avatar belongs to, and if it does something bad, who do you blame, and who pays the fine or goes to prison? And
thank you.
It's much worse than just what we've got with the effectively two-dimensional web space. And
I know I can't rely on any sort of bodily cues actually to move on to the next person. It's always very difficult doing this hybrid. So I mean, Wendy, for me, that moves me on to the very last question I wanted to ask before we go to the audience, which I think is one for you, Nick. So, Wendy, you flagged there, several issues other than competition, which are really key consumer protections issues, so particularly around things like authentication, identification. Obviously, Benedict, you talk quite a bit about privacy. And I suppose, Nick, from your perspective, the work that you've been doing at Deloitte, it sounds as if, to me, what you're identifying is a continuing and possibly expanding role, actually, for regulatory agencies in protecting users. I know there's one message here, which is that younger people are more aware, they are more able to take protective actions, they understand these things. And yet, it's by no means a sort of entirely positive picture. So I just wonder where you felt you stood in that, what the data's telling you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So daily I work with internet companies who are trying to operationalize and practically respond to the bow wave of different regulations coming across competition and online content and behavior, consumer protection, privacy, illicit finance, taxation, and so on and so on and so on. Having clarity of regulatory intent is super important. So that point which Benedict made about that poor, probably quite highly paid, let's be honest, Silicon Valley engineer being caught between the demands of privacy and competition, there needs to be regulatory cooperation in order to create clear expectations of these global platforms so that you get what you want. So it's not, being able to follow through on lots of the ideas which have come through on the panels about regulators working together both between different countries and blocks, but also between different parts of the regulatory ecosystem. And I feel very encouraged by what I see within the UK, and we've talked about it a bit today, the DRCF, the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, if I've got that right. Thank you, Will. And bringing together the regulators for data and privacy, for financial conduct, for competition, and for communications. And that kind of cooperation, consistency, and clarity, I think, is going to be really important for internet companies if you want to get the outcomes which society, policymakers, governments expect.
I completely agree, and we were delighted to see that the birth of the DRCF, certainly at OII. I think one of the things that frustrates us a lot at OII, been in this space since 2002, so we really have seen this field develop enormously, is that we really hoped that, particularly on issues of consumer protection, we would actually see companies competing to better serve their consumers, to provide people with more privacy protecting options, or to provide safer options for families, etc. And yet it isn't really a market that it's a market that still doesn't seem to be able to sort of succeed again in the face of these network effects with the big players. So yeah, much needed. Panel, I'm going to move, if that's all right, onto some questions from our audience, which are coming through right now. So those of you watching virtually, those in the audience, keep typing your questions in. I'm going to take a first question here, precisely on this point that we were just discussing, actually, around different issues, so consumer protection and competition issues. So the question here says the tension between privacy and competition is something that we all recognise. Benedict, how do you see this tension playing out, where decisions can build in the dominance of an existing player, perhaps therefore undermining innovation through competition and also chilling the market for startup founders to sell out, start another business, also want to become a VC? So how do you see this tension between privacy and competition playing out?
Well, the classic formulation, as I said, is that the privacy regulator says you must make it hard to get your data out, and the competition regulator says you must make it easy to get your data out. And I think this also comes to these sort of formulations like your data belongs to you, which, sort of, apologies to my fellow panelists, I think is almost entirely nonsense. In that, if you want to compete with Instagram, if I want to compete with Instagram, I don't really need your pictures. I need to know who follows you and who else they follow, and which pictures those other people have liked, and who's liked their pictures, and what other pictures those people have liked, and so on outwards in a sort of concentric mesh of, and it's all those sort of intersections of interactions between people that creates the data, and that allows somebody to know what you're interested in, what you would not be interested in, and therefore what pictures to show you or not show you. And most of those aren't yours, or at least that data is both you and other people. The very simple framing is, if I send you a picture, if I send you an email, is that your data or my data? And so then if one goes to Instagram and says, well, you have to let me export my data, Instagram will say, well, you can export your data, but that's not actually the bit anybody wants. And so that, I think, is the challenge with statements like you should own your data, in that most of the value is actually kind of intermeshed and intermixed with other people, and also very hard then for a privacy regulator to understand how you could move that around. And to the high level point, I think a lot of these companies, or rather a lot of these products are essentially natural monopolies. That we would all sort of understand you can't kind of split up a water company and kind of divide the pipe down the street between two companies. And in the same way, it's very difficult to break YouTube up into separate businesses. You could make YouTube a separate company, but that wouldn't make it any easier to compete with YouTube. And obviously, of course, it would be quite difficult for the CMA to do that. You know, the US could do that, which is the geographic point. But the network effects tend to be internal to the product, not to the holding company that might own 2 or 3 of these. If you're in the advertising industry, yes, that would make things more competitive. But as a user or as an entrepreneur, it wouldn't be easy to compete with Instagram if Facebook didn't own it. In fact, it might be harder to compete with Instagram if Facebook didn't own it. So you kind of have to think about what those demarcations are. Between where is the data, what kind of data are we talking about, who is this useful for? You know, Instagram's data isn't particularly useful to Tesla. In fact, Tesla couldn't do anything with that. It's a different kind of data. Data isn't fungible. It's not all one thing that you can just kind of throw into a pot and then get AI out of the other end. Which kind of comes to the point that I sort of made in the presentation, which is that generally this stuff is kind of complicated and full of trade-offs, and there isn't like a nice simple answer, and you kind of have to go and do the work on each one. I think, you know, I mentioned Web3 specifically in my presentation, but it is kind of worth going back to this again, both as an illustration of like, by the time we've regulated Instagram, no one might be using it anymore. We might all be doing it on Web3. And if you're doing it on Web3, then all the regulatory questions will be different questions. How does privacy work? How does competition work? What does it mean to control who can see your data if it's all running on some public network? But also in that sense that this industry just keeps changing. If you built a social network on a blockchain, it wouldn't be Twitter or Instagram, it would be something else, just as TikTok isn't like a mobile version of YouTube. And so part of the regulatory challenge is sort of which level of abstraction do you go to? Do you just say, well, all social networks, or do you just say TikTok, or do you try and, how do you find the kind of the path to analyze all of these different questions?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point about this, the level of analysis, the level of focus. When I look at something like the Digital Safety Bill, you know, going past Parliament at the moment, you know, what should be the correct focus of that? It necessarily, I think, has implications for competition in the marketplace. You know, quite apart from the fact, obviously, it imposes very significant costs that the larger players will, you know, be much more able to bear. So, yeah, I think this is a really good question. Just curious,
actually. I mean, to that point, regulation always tends to be good for incumbents. And partly because it's cost, but also because it does tend to sort of bake in the existing market structures and then require any new company to fit into a regulatory structure that was sort of premised on the old way that you did things.
You've put the point rather beautifully, because I was actually going to turn to Brian on precisely that question. I mean, you know, as we know that the regulation does bake in existing market structures, for entrepreneurs, though, are they looking at that with a view of finding a gap, if you like? Does certain regulation, if you like, provide more opportunity than uncertain regulatory landscape in this field?
I mean, I'm part of a group called Tech NYC, which is like almost like a lobbying group for New York tech companies. And we're I don't know, 7 or 8 years in. And I realized that most of our lobbying work is for Silicon Valley established companies like Uber and Airbnb. That the things that we care about as entrepreneurs are things like, I can't buy crypto in New York. It's illegal. If you say you have a New York address, you can't actually buy crypto, which is weird. You know, when you have a mayor who says that he wants to be the first mayor ever paid in Bitcoin, I really hope he sold it, because it ain't worth a whole lot right now. And all my friends who moved to Miami, we'll welcome you back with open arms, now that you kind of want to come back. But the challenge for an entrepreneur, to answer your question directly, is that I can't start a company hoping for regulation that may not happen. So regulatory environments are critical, and when they change, I think to your point about stability and really knowing like what the environment is, it's when they change that's dangerous. There's a whole Silicon Valley theory of, you know, basically break the rules. Uber broke the rules. Airbnb broke the rules. And that's the other side of this, which is, you know, that's a really significant part of what's made these companies happen. So I don't know. I mean, that's the biggest challenge for any of us is, you know, I'm in sustainability, right? And we have tons of regulation happening in Europe, and we have SEC regulations may be coming in the US. And then there's, Fiona, we were talking about, will the WTO allow a, border tax on carbon, and what will that do to global supply chains? And all of this uncertainty is my everyday life. I don't know anything that's going to happen, and I have to create a future or believe in a future in which I have some level of control and that I can bring other people along with me. And that includes being here today and hoping that all of you are wise and thoughtful and care about entrepreneurs and also care about the good of everyday prosumers, Wendy, as we go about our business.
Can I say something?
Go on.
Was that a go on?
Yes, go on, Wendy. Yes.
So, two things. One, I totally agree. The phrase, give people their data back is a meaningless phrase. It's a shorthand, because I absolutely agree with the points about, it's very little data is actually our data. It's always actually shared with someone else, and it's all that arrangement and who wants what out of the relationship that's important. Take health data as another example. But I just want to follow up that I think that absolutely we cannot predict what technology is going to evolve, how it's going to evolve, and largely that's because we don't know what people, and that's on both sides of the market, the prosumers, as I like to call them, or the companies, that it's very hard to predict how either, because we are in these social machines that work together, and we can't predict what the results will be. So I think we have to take a human-centered approach to regulation. And I think that's what's going to protect us going forward, whether you're talking about what's happening on the internet, like the online safety bill, when you're talking about what's happening with AI. I really think, I see that there's people talking about, so the EU's taking the regulation approach is very risk-based. That's largely based on what the product does, the company does. And the UK's approach is likely to be context sector-based. It all makes sense. But I think at the core of it's got to be protecting people. And I actually think that that's what we should be, because that's going to be true, whatever happens, that people need protecting. And so I think it has to be human-centered, which is why I think Web3, some form of Web3 that makes sense for going forward in a sustainable way, that is sustainable for the planet and for our society, is the way to go, and that we focus regulation on as a human-centered activity.
I would 100% agree with that, Wendy. I'm going to move the conversation on to another question. The question's been asked, and I'm going to slightly change the focus because I'm sitting here. So there's a question here which points out all the different ways in which regulation standards making can have significant implications for competition. And the question points to, for example, changes in internet standards in the IETF, so the Internet Engineers Task Force, for example, which has done a huge amount over the years to generate the fundamental standards and protocols along which the internet functions. And the points made here, it says no competition, or virtually no competition, and consumer agencies are active participants in standards bodies like the IETF, so risk being surprised by changes that come out of these bodies. How do you believe how the panel believe that agencies should address this blind spot? So I'm going to broaden this question. How do any of you on the panel think that people in this room, people sitting in the various sort of regulatory agencies looking at issues like competition and consumer protection, how can they better resource themselves to prevent surprises like this, whether that be sitting on standards bodies or other suggestions? Yeah, what more can they do to understand this, Nick?
I can give a short answer. I guess one of the observations is that in the draft of the DMA, Digital Markets Act, there is a requirement for interoperability between existing instant messaging services. And that's quite a tall order, especially given the context of what Benedict shared earlier. My observation would be that the standard for SMS, for text messaging, was developed a long time before it became popular. Same with the standard for interoperable email. Getting standards right needs to happen before you force organizations to adopt them, rather than to try to impose standards which result in breaking up existing vertically integrated businesses practically, and I think for consumer benefit as well. That would be my perspective.
Okay. Anybody else?
It reminds me of, I think it was a book, but it was talking about how every country had its own width of railroad tracks. And that, it's hard to think about that from a competitive lens in the sense that, would it be better or worse to have all the trains go across countries? But I think that in some ways, those different size railroad tracks protected local markets. And we see that across Europe right now, where because France and Germany and the UK operate very differently, we have protected environments in which to do things. And in some ways, those standards merge everything into one global market. And so I do think that it comes back to the question of who regulates what that, Benedict, you raised, which is that if the US is the biggest market and the UK is far larger than the rest of the European markets, how do we deal with companies that operate globally and standards that are truly global? And the more interoperability and the more technical depth, the harder this is to understand. So I love the question. I think it's brilliant. I think every regulator should be a computer scientist. But that might be my personal bias. And I think that,
God, no.
Okay, well, fine.
They should all come to the OII instead.
You should be a computer scientist. Is that what you said?
Well, why not? If I get to be on the panel, I can say it.
Of course you can. But it's got to be. We can't. And if you leave the world to computer scientists, the end of the human race will be before the end of this century.
That's a really bleak prospect there, Wendy.
Martin Rees said yesterday, and he gave us 2 centuries, and Stephen Hawking gave us 1.
Wow. My God, I feel like I might just give up and go home now.
I think
Benedict, just on this general question, what more can regulators of all types, but particularly competition regulators, do to prepare themselves to manage these issues better?
Well, obviously the implication of the question is that government needs to give, all governments need to give all competition regulators much more money. I mean, the standards question is kind of an interesting one because sort of innovation happens at lots of different layers in the stack. And so sometimes you have kind of a generalized industry standard that everybody builds on, which gets you to things like, IP networks and so on. But there's always this sort of embrace and extend pressure to, everybody building on top of a standardized system wants to innovate on top of it, and they want to innovate faster than the standards can move, and they want to innovate faster than their competitors, and so they add stuff to it. And so you saw that in the web in the 1990s, and I suspect you're going to see it with crypto now, in that everybody wants to be more open than everybody else, but lots of people are kind of going to create their own projects on top to try and create their own value. And it's been a long time since a large top-down government-controlled central standards bodies were operating at the same layer as all of the innovation. And if one thinks now about mobile, for example, the standardized layers are buried deep within it. It's the cellular network and its IP networks and its HTML, and maybe it's ARM, which is a kind of a de facto standard. But all the innovation is 4 or 5 levels further up the stack. So it's kind of challenging to see that much competition question coming out of those agencies, but I don't know. But I mean, the general point is, how much technology regulator do you want? This is always a question, do you have a technology regulator, or do you say, well, the financial bit happens inside the finance regulator and the competition bit happens inside the competition regulator and so on? Where do you put that expertise?
I think that's probably quite a good question for us to sort of maybe spend the last 5 minutes we've got on. So there's a point here from one of the questions in the audience saying, looking at particular issues which might be very, very challenging for regulation, focusing on coercive advertising programs, the use of AI to sort of drive these, if you like, in a way that perhaps are weaponizing against our own instincts. That's an example, it seems to me, of a really sort of tough problem for regulators to deal with that might require either interventions across different regulators, perhaps new interventions. So I want to finish with one last question, perhaps for all of you in turn, which is, what do you think, in terms of, if you look at your future, the technological future we have in front of us at the moment, what poses the greatest challenge from a regulatory perspective? It doesn't have to be just competition. It could be a tech problem, it could be a consumer problem, it could be, a market problem. But what do you think is the greatest challenge that regulators will face in managing these industries in the next 5 to 10 years? Anyone like to go first? Anyone think of one straight away? If not, I'll be a teacher and pick.
I'll go, because I'll just repeat what I said before.
Oh, Wendy.
I think it's really important that we shift regulation to making it human-focused and rather than thinking of it from how do we regulate the technology? Because I think that will be the foundation. Now, I don't fully understand I don't know. That doesn't mean I know what I'm talking about here. That's not the way to say it, is it? I don't know how to do that, but I really do think that that is a very, very important thing for us to think about for the future. Because we can't predict what technology, interesting, although we can't predict what technology will do, human beings, as Martin Rees and Stephen Hawking said, are actually quite slow to evolve. And there's a lot of, my social scientist friends, and Vicky knows more about this than I do, will have lots of debates about what could we have predicted about what society would have done with the web if we'd known what the web was, a chicken and egg type thing. And because there are certain things that we do, that people do and have done for millennia, and there are other things that are affected by the time you live in. And I think having some foundational principles about what it means to make sure that people are protected from in terms of, I'll say their data, but I realise that's shorthand for a very complicated thing. The data that they generate is a really important shift going forward. And there's no easy answers to what it means, but I do think that's the answer. I do think that's something we should really explore.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wendy. So, yeah, not regulating technologies, thinking about regulation for human interests, for people. Who's next?
I can go next. I mean, I think there's maybe two constants in here. One of them is speed and the other is moral panic. And, I'm just about old enough to remember when people thought that, it was the joke that, to remember the moral panic around raves, that this was going to destroy civilization. Probably other people in the room are old enough to remember when punk and rock and roll were the end of civilization, and maybe comic books, and certainly TV and rap music. And novels were going to make young women infertile, and the bicycle certainly would. And no responsible parent would allow a French novel in the house. And now we have these phrases like surveillance advertising, or indeed I think what was kind of in the question, coercive advertising, which to me remind me a lot of phrases like pro-life and pro-choice, in that you're attempting to define the argument and define the question into victory rather than actually engaging with any of the questions. And surveillance sounds terrible. Well, we don't like that, do we? So is that the question? Is that what it is? Maybe it's something else. How do we think about this? And so as this stuff has happened so quickly, and as it's become so sort of systemically important to society, we have a sort of a rush of people worrying, some of those concerns justified, some justified more than others, a rush of people trying to create answers, very often trying to create easy slogans, which was my point about Elizabeth Warren, or indeed surveillance capitalism. And we kind of have to kind of pull those apart and remember when we decided to give people enormous criminal penalties for running a rave back in the early 1990s, and wonder whether that was a good idea. I think the other point I would go to again is speed. That this is not a mature industry yet. It's not like regulating supermarkets or industrial food or aircraft, where nothing much changes from year to year. The whole nature of the market changes a great deal. And I think, both the point I've made and also the point that we've also made about Web3 is important here. If you're using a social network that's run on a blockchain, there's no one in charge. There's no CEO. There's nobody there's no one person who can say we're going to change how it works. All of the data, or large portions of the data, are theoretically public. And so just the kind of mechanics of how you would even formulate a policy and then get that formulated and then get that policy implemented just don't apply in anything like the way that they would if you would go to either General Motors or Facebook. So that is maybe the most kind of concrete kind of question. If Web3 does become the next way that the internet gets built, which is the way people working on it believe, and if we do in 10 years' time use applications that are running on Web3, they will not be limited companies with a CEO in anything like the way that we recognize, and they will not function in the way that traditional technology companies have functioned. And so that would pose a lot of questions for a lot of assumptions around how technology regulation works.
I think that's a really excellent point. You've got to be really careful of what we ask for here.
I'm not sure that's true, sorry.
Yeah, Wendy, I'm going to move on if that's all right, because yes, I've only got 2 more minutes. But yeah, I wish you were here in the green room so that we could actually have an argument about this after with you and Bennett. It'd be really good. Yeah.
I'll keep it relatively brief. Maybe drawing one thread right from the start of Benedict's panel about the level of focus on regulation. Clearly in tech, people don't necessarily unprompted focus on regulation. Certainly when we're polling the general public, if you ask someone on the street, what are you worried about in your life? Very few people will say they're worried about tech regulation, being brutally honest. They will say they're worried about opportunities for their kids. They're worried about having good jobs. They're worried about having safe and affordable housing. These are the things which matter to people as human beings. And to take Wendy's point about being human-centered, I think we need to take our responsibility as thought leaders, regulators, policymakers seriously, because we are doing the work on behalf of this citizens, consumers. We need to have their interests at heart, even if they can't articulate these issues proactively. And we need to almost, be very responsible in how we are setting and enforcing these policies on their behalf.
Thank you.
That's it.
I would not disagree with any of that. Brian, you get the last word.
I'll just build on that and say, stepping back from technology even further, we live in a time of great inequality, terrifying, global political tensions. There's a war, not so far away from us. We have onshoring of technology and the bifurcation of the internet. We have political tension that's tearing the United States apart and other countries. And I worry that when we really get to the core issues that we have to resolve, privacy is important, but it may not be as important as some of the fundamental things we can do to make sure that we create opportunity and that we don't tear ourselves apart in this process. I have no idea how you should deal with that, but I do feel like there's a higher purpose here that's really hard to see, at least for me, in my little New York City tech bubble.
Yeah, just a reminder of what we're dealing with, and there are other items out there perhaps that matter slightly more. So yes, think about this, talk about this, get it right from a human perspective, but think about the wider issues too. I need to thank our panel for a really, really fascinating debate this afternoon. Thank you so much for contributing. Wendy, Benedict, Nick, Brian, it's been a really great conversation, and thank you very much for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky.
Just very briefly, coffee break now. Reconvene at 3 o'clock, please. Thanks very much, Vicky, for chairing into the panel.